For nearly 3 decades, Hugh Jackman and Deborra Lee Furness looked untouchable. Not in the flashy Hollywood way, not like the couples who survive on red carpets, rehearsed smiles, and headlines designed to sell a fantasy. Their marriage felt older than that, deeper than that, almost sacred in the eyes of fans who had watched them stand beside each other year after year. While other celebrity love stories rose and collapsed in public, theirs seemed to rest on something stronger, something quieter, something real. That is why the silence around its ending became so loud. When they announced their separation in September 2023, the language was graceful, respectful, careful. It spoke of gratitude, nearly 3 decades together, and a new focus on individual growth. On paper, it sounded like one of those rare, mature Hollywood endings, the kind where two people simply evolve and move in different directions without bitterness, scandal, or public destruction. But the problem with polished statements is that they often arrive long before the real emotions do. Because behind every calm public message, there is always another story, the private one, the sleepless one, the one built from broken trust, unanswered questions, and the painful realization that a life once shared is slowly becoming separate territory. And when Deborra Lee finally broke her silence in 2025, her words cut through that earlier polished narrative like glass. She described the collapse of the marriage as a profound wound and referred to a traumatic journey of betrayal. Those were not the words of someone merely closing a chapter. Those were the words of someone still carrying the bruise of what had happened. That changed everything. Because in an instant, the public stopped viewing this as a simple uncoupling. It became something more haunting, more uncomfortable, more emotionally charged. Suddenly, people were no longer asking how two adults respectfully ended a long marriage. They were asking what really happened behind the scenes, how long the hurt had been there, and whether the fairy tale everyone believed in had been quietly cracking long before the official announcement ever arrived. And now comes the part that makes this story sting even harder. As Hugh Jackman's post-marriage life continued moving into public view, particularly with Sutton Foster, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The relationship was confirmed in early 2025, and from that point on, every sighting, every appearance, every smiling photograph added a new layer of discomfort to the public reading of Deborra Lee's pain. Because whether fair or not, that is how these stories work. One person appears to be stepping forward. The other appears to be standing in the wreckage. One becomes the face of a new chapter. The other becomes the face of what it cost. And that is where the phrase, "a kick in the teeth," begins to feel so brutal and so believable. Not necessarily because of a literal wedding announcement, not because of one single act, and not because the public knows every hidden detail, but because emotionally, that is exactly how it looks from the outside. When a woman spends nearly 30 years building a life, protecting a partnership, and helping shape the image of one of Hollywood's most beloved men, the idea of watching the next romantic chapter form in public can feel less like closure and more like humiliation with cameras attached. That is what makes Deborra Lee's silence so powerful. She did not give the world a messy exposé. She did not list accusations. She did not turn the ending into a circus. Instead, she said just enough to let people understand that beneath the elegant headlines, there had been real damage, real grief, real betrayal, at least in the way she experienced the end of that marriage. And sometimes that is even more devastating than an all-out scandal, because what is left unsaid begins echoing louder than anything spoken directly. It also forces people to look backward, back to old interviews, old red carpets, old moments of affection that once looked reassuring and now feel eerie in retrospect. Fans begin doing what fans always do when an iconic relationship falls apart. They rewatch everything. They search for the first crack, the first sign of distance, the first moment one person looked more invested than the other. Whether those clues were ever really there almost does not matter. Once a story changes shape, the past gets rewritten in everyone's mind. And Hugh Jackman is not just any celebrity in this equation. For years, he carried one of the cleanest reputations in entertainment. Charming, loyal, devoted, humble. The rare leading man whose marriage seemed to reinforce his image rather than complicate it. So when that image collides with words like betrayal, the shock is bigger, the dissonance is harsher. The audience does not just feel curious, they feel unsettled. Because if a marriage this admired can end with pain this sharp, then maybe the public never really knew the story at all. And maybe that is what makes Deborra Lee's silence breaking feel so devastating. It was not loud, but it shattered something. Not only the image of a marriage, but the illusion that endings like this happen cleanly. They do not. One person's fresh start can become another person's deepest wound. One public smile can feel like salt in a private scar. One new romance can make an old life feel instantly disposable. So now the world keeps watching, not because it loves heartbreak, but because heartbreak attached to a once-beloved fairy tale is impossible to look away from. And for Deborra Lee, that may be the cruelest part of all. The marriage is over. The silence is over. The illusion is over. But the pain of seeing the next chapter begin before the last one has stopped bleeding may be the wound that lingers the longest. What makes this story so difficult to shake is not just the separation itself. It is the contrast between what the public was once told to believe and what Deborra Lee's later words seemed to reveal. For years, Hugh Jackman and Deborra Lee Furness were sold to the world as proof that Hollywood could still produce something lasting. They had the longevity, they had the devotion, they had the kind of relationship people pointed to when they wanted to believe that fame did not always destroy love. When they announced their separation in September 2023, the statement sounded almost gentle, describing nearly 3 decades together and a decision to focus on individual growth. But once Deborra Lee later described the end of the marriage as a profound wound and referenced a traumatic journey of betrayal, that softer version of events became much harder to accept at face value. And that is where the emotional temperature of this story changed. Because the public can handle a breakup. What unsettles people is the suspicion that the truth was far more painful than the polished version first presented. The clean statement suddenly started looking like a curtain, something placed carefully in front of a much uglier reality. And once that thought enters the conversation, everything else begins to feel heavier. Every old interview, every old red carpet smile, every affectionate quote from the past starts to look less like evidence of security and more like a fragile image that was already under strain. Then came Hugh's very visible new chapter. His relationship with Sutton Foster was confirmed in January 2025, and by October 2025, the two had made their red carpet debut together. Since then, their appearances have continued into 2026, including a Broadway date night reported this week. Publicly, it now looks less like a passing rumor and more like a relationship moving forward with confidence. That is exactly why this hits so hard for people who sympathize with Deborra Lee. Because once a new relationship starts appearing this openly, the emotional math becomes brutal. It no longer feels abstract. It no longer feels like 2 separate private lives quietly unfolding after a divorce. It starts to feel like one person is building momentum while the other is still being publicly defined by pain. Whether that perception is entirely fair is almost beside the point. In celebrity stories, perception becomes its own reality. And this one has been shaped by timing, silence, and the emotional force of Deborra Lee's own words. And maybe that is why the phrase "breaks silence" matters so much here. Silence is powerful because it delays judgment. For a long time, Deborra Lee said very little. That restraint protected the dignity of the family and kept the story from exploding immediately into something uglier. But the downside of silence is that when it finally breaks, people assume the person speaking has reached a limit. They assume the hurt has become too deep to keep carrying quietly. So when Deborra Lee finally spoke in 2025, the words landed with a force far beyond a normal post-divorce statement. They sounded like the voice of someone who had been holding the roof up for a very long time and could no longer pretend the house had not collapsed. That is what gives this story its sting. Not simply that Hugh appears to have moved on, not simply that the marriage ended, but that the emotional narratives of the two people now feel completely uneven. On one side, there is visibility, movement, new companionship, public appearances, and what looks like forward motion. On the other, there is a statement filled with grief, betrayal, and the kind of language that suggests the end was not neat, not balanced, and certainly not painless. And when fans sense imbalance, they start asking darker questions. Was Deborra Lee blindsided emotionally, even if the separation itself was no surprise? Had the bond already been weakening for years, while the public still saw a solid marriage? Did the private truth become unbearable long before the official split was announced? Those questions remain unanswered publicly. What is public is narrower. The couple announced their separation in September 2023. Deborra Lee filed for divorce in May 2025. The divorce was finalized in June 2025, and by then, Hugh's new relationship had already become a major part of the public conversation. That sequence is what fuels the discomfort, because even when there is no formal wedding announcement, the emotional meaning is already there. A new romance that becomes serious, visible, and embraced by the public can feel to the other side like a symbolic replacement. Like history being overwritten in real time. Like years of shared life being pushed into the background while cameras rush to capture the new leading lady. And for a woman who spent decades beside one of Hollywood's most admired men, that kind of public transition can look less like healing and more like erasure. That is why so many people are watching Deborra Lee now with a different kind of attention. Not as the ex-wife in a celebrity split, but as the person whose silence made the story seem calm, and whose honesty later revealed just how much pain may have been hidden beneath the surface. In that sense, her words changed the center of gravity. The story stopped being only about Hugh's next chapter. It became about the emotional cost of the last one. And once a story becomes about cost, people stop looking at smiles the same way. They start wondering what was traded away to get them. What makes this story even more emotionally explosive is that the word wedding does not have to be official to hurt. That is the dark magic of celebrity headlines. A relationship does not need a ring, a date, or a formal announcement for the public to start imagining the next step. Once Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster began appearing more openly as a couple, first through reports in early 2025, then through a red carpet debut in October 2025, and now with continued public outings into April 2026, the picture in people's minds became clear. They see momentum. They see seriousness. They see the possibility of something permanent, whether anyone has confirmed it or not. And for Deborra Lee, that public momentum may be exactly what makes the whole thing feel like such a brutal insult. Because heartbreak is one thing when it stays private. It is another when the world begins narrating your replacement before your pain has even cooled. That is why the phrase, "a kick in the teeth," lands so hard here. It captures the emotional violence of timing, not literal violence, not some single public act, but the cold feeling of watching a shared life fade into background scenery while everyone else rushes to celebrate what comes next. That is why Deborra Lee's statement hit people the way it did. When her divorce from Hugh Jackman was finalized in June 2025, she spoke about a traumatic journey of betrayal and called the breakdown of the marriage a profound wound that cuts deep. Those words instantly changed the emotional frame of the whole story. They made it impossible to keep viewing the split as just a calm, mature uncoupling. They suggested that whatever happened privately felt far more devastating than the elegant public language that had first surrounded the separation in 2023. And once those words were out, every later image of Hugh smiling beside Sutton started carrying a different weight. That is the cruel thing about public perception. It does not care whether the full truth is known. It only needs contrast. On one side, Deborra Lee is associated with grief, betrayal, and the emotional wreckage of a nearly 30-year marriage. On the other, Hugh is associated with a visible romance that appears increasingly comfortable in the spotlight. Even if real life is more complicated than that, the public story has already divided them into emotional roles. She becomes the wounded figure from the old chapter. He becomes the face of the new one. And that division is what makes this story feel less like a divorce and more like an image collapse. Because Hugh Jackman did not just lose a marriage in the public eye. He lost the protection that marriage once gave his image. For years, he seemed almost unusually safe by Hollywood standards. Loyal, grounded, stable. The long marriage itself was part of that identity. It reassured people. It supported the idea that he was different from other stars. So when Deborra Lee introduced words like betrayal into the conversation, the damage went beyond a private split. It shook the entire mythology around him. That is why people keep circling back to timing. Not because the public has proof of every hidden detail, but because timing is often the only clue people think they have. Hugh and Deborra Lee announced their separation in September 2023. Sutton Foster filed for divorce from Ted Griffin in October 2024. Hugh and Sutton's romance became public in January 2025. Hugh and Deborra Lee's divorce was then finalized in June 2025. That sequence, fair or not, is exactly the kind of timeline that invites suspicion, rewrites memories, and keeps rumor channels alive. And once suspicion takes hold, people start reading emotion into everything. They read it into the old body language. They read it into past interviews. They read it into the silences. Was Deborra Lee trying to hold together something that was already slipping away? Did she know, long before the public knew? Was the polished announcement in 2023 already covering a wound that had been growing in private for much longer? Those questions remain unanswered in any official sense. But emotionally, they are what keep the story burning. Because the public does not just want facts in stories like this. It wants meaning. It wants someone to blame, someone to protect, and some hidden turning point that explains how a marriage of 27 years could end with words this painful hanging over it. And perhaps that is the harshest twist of all. If Hugh and Sutton continue moving forward publicly, then every new sighting risks feeling like another chapter in a story Deborra Lee never asked to watch. A Broadway night out, a vacation, a red carpet appearance, even something as ordinary as being photographed looking happy can take on a brutal symbolic meaning when placed next to her language about betrayal. It starts to look less like moving on and more like emotional replacement in real time. That perception may not tell the whole truth, but it is powerful enough to shape how millions of people see everyone involved. So no, there may not be a confirmed wedding, but in the court of public emotion, that almost does not matter. Because once the world starts imagining the next ceremony, the next commitment, the next forever, the old forever suddenly looks disposable. And for a woman who spent nearly 3 decades building that old forever, there may be no crueler feeling than realizing the world is already romanticizing what comes after you. That is when heartbreak stops feeling private. That is when it turns into humiliation. The most painful part of this story may be that no one had to say the word replacement out loud for the public to feel it. That is what happens when a marriage lasts almost 3 decades. It stops being just a relationship and starts becoming part of a person's identity. Deborra Lee was not simply Hugh Jackman's wife in the public imagination. She was part of the foundation of his image, part of the emotional architecture that made his success look grounded, warm, and trustworthy. For many fans, she was woven into the story of who he was. So when that marriage ended, and then his new relationship with Sutton Foster became more visible, it did not feel like one romance ending and another beginning. It felt like the old story was being cleared away, to make room for a new version of him, people.com. People.com. And that is why Deborra Lee's words still hang over everything. She did not accuse the public. She did not attack Hugh in a long interview. She did not turn this into a public war. But by describing the end of the marriage as a profound wound and speaking of the traumatic journey of betrayal, she gave the world just enough to understand that the pain behind the divorce was not abstract. It was intimate, deep, personal. Her statement changed the emotional temperature of the story because it turned a polished celebrity separation into something raw and harder to ignore. People.com. People.com. And once a story becomes emotional in that way, every future milestone starts looking crueler than it might otherwise seem. A date night is no longer just a date night. A red carpet is no longer just a red carpet. A supportive appearance becomes a signal. A smiling photograph becomes a statement. That is exactly what has happened with Hugh and Sutton. Their romance was confirmed in January 2025. They made their red carpet debut as a couple in October 2025. Hugh later went Instagram official with Sutton in November 2025. And this week, on the 14th of April, 2026, they were publicly seen enjoying another Broadway date night in New York. Each step may look ordinary on its own, but together they create the feeling of a relationship steadily moving forward in public. People.com. 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 And that public forward motion is what makes the wedding angle feel so emotionally loaded, even without any confirmed wedding plans. Right now, I have not found a credible report confirming an engagement or wedding between Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster. What exists publicly is something different, but just as powerful for rumor channels. A visible romance, repeated appearances, and source-based reporting that the two are excited about a future together. That is enough for the public imagination to do the rest. People.com. And for Deborra Lee, that is where the sting may be worst. Because in real emotional terms, the public does not wait for vows. It starts writing the next chapter, the moment it sees momentum. The world begins imagining commitment, long before commitment is formally announced. It begins guessing about homes, futures, marriage, permanence, and if you are the person standing on the other side of that, still associated with betrayal and heartbreak, those guesses can feel like tiny public humiliations stacking one on top of another. That is what makes this feel like more than a normal celebrity split. There is a difference between moving on and moving on in front of an audience that still remembers who built the first life with you. Deborra Lee was there before the peak of the mythology, before the untouchable image, before Hugh Jackman became the kind of star whose personal life was treated as proof of character. So, when the next romance starts drawing applause, some people inevitably look back and wonder whether the woman who helped build that image is now being quietly edited out of it. And that question is hard to escape. Not because the facts are fully known, not because every rumor is true, but because the emotional sequence is so stark. First, the separation. In September 2023, then Deborra Lee filing for divorce in May 2025. Then, her betrayal statement. Then, the divorce being finalized in June 2025. Meanwhile, Hugh's relationship with Sutton was already public, increasingly visible, and by late 2025, openly presented to the world as serious and forward-looking. People.com. 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 That sequence may not prove everything people suspect, but it explains why the optics are so brutal. Because when one person speaks the language of wounds and betrayal, while the other is photographed in a relationship that appears to be growing more secure by the month, the public instinctively turns the contrast into a story of loss and replacement. Again, that may not be the whole truth, but it is the version that feels emotionally real to many people watching from the outside. And maybe that is what Deborra Lee's silence was really protecting all along. Not just privacy, not just family, but dignity. Because the moment dignity gives way to public comparison, the old marriage is no longer judged by what it was. It gets judged by how quickly the next one seems to be forming in the shadows of it. And for someone who gave 27 years to a shared life, there may be no colder feeling than realizing the world is already treating your heartbreak like a bridge to someone else's happily ever after. What gives this story its real power is not a confirmed wedding. It is the humiliation people imagine before a wedding ever happens. That is the part celebrity culture understands better than almost anything else. The audience does not wait for formal milestones. It does not wait for an engagement ring, a wedding invitation, or a carefully staged announcement. The moment a new relationship begins to look stable, affectionate, and public, people start mentally fast-forwarding. They picture forever. They picture marriage. They picture the old partner being left behind in emotional ruins while the new chapter gets all the light. And that is exactly why this situation has felt so cruel to so many people watching Deborra Lee. Because Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster are not being treated by the public like a casual fling anymore, their relationship became public. In January 2025, they made their red carpet debut in October 2025, and reporting since then has framed them as happy, serious, and excited about a future together. This week's Broadway date night on the 14th of April 2026 only reinforced that image. What the public sees now is not uncertainty. It sees momentum. That momentum is what turns Deborra Lee's pain into something so much sharper. Because once one side of a broken marriage appears to be moving comfortably into a public future, the other side risks being frozen in the role of emotional aftermath. Deborra Lee's own words made that impossible to ignore. When the divorce was finalized in 2025, she spoke of a traumatic journey of betrayal and described the end of the marriage as a profound wound. After language like that, every smiling photo of Hugh with Sutton starts to feel heavier, whether that is fair to him or not. The public no longer reads those images innocently. It reads them through Deborra Lee's hurt. And that is where the phrase "break silence" becomes devastating. Silence can preserve dignity, but it can also hide damage. For a long time, Deborra Lee said almost nothing publicly beyond the graceful separation announcement in 2023. That announcement emphasized gratitude and individual growth, which allowed people to imagine a respectful, mature ending. But once she later used the language of betrayal, the earlier statement took on a different meaning. It started to look less like the full truth and more like a shield placed over something far more painful. That shift matters because it changes how people interpret everything that followed. Now, the story is not just about a marriage ending. It is about what that ending may have cost emotionally. Hugh and Deborra Lee announced their separation in September 2023. Deborra Lee filed for divorce in May 2025, and the divorce was finalized in June 2025. By then, Hugh's relationship with Sutton was already part of the public conversation. Even without proof of every private detail, that timeline is enough to make people feel the contrast. One chapter was ending in public grief, while another was already moving ahead in public view. And once people feel that contrast, they start asking harsher questions. Did Deborra Lee have to watch the world romanticize Hugh's next chapter before she had even finished surviving the last one? Did the elegant public language in 2023 hide private devastation that only surfaced later? Was the image of a respectful uncoupling always too neat to be true? Those questions remain public speculation, not established fact. But speculation is exactly what drives a story like this. The confirmed facts are enough to keep that speculation alive. The separation, the divorce, Deborra Lee's betrayal statement, and Hugh's increasingly visible relationship with Sutton. Everything else grows from the emotional gaps between those facts. And maybe that is why the wedding angle feels so vicious, even without an actual wedding. Because emotionally, a visible future can wound almost as much as a formal commitment. When sources describe Hugh and Sutton as excited to share their future together, The words land very differently depending on which side of the story you are standing on. To people rooting for the new couple, it sounds hopeful. To people who sympathize with Deborra Lee, it sounds like a public celebration built on top of a still open scar. That is the heart of the cruelty here. Not certainty, but optics. Not proof, but symbolism. Not a confirmed ceremony, but the feeling that the world is already emotionally planning one. And for a woman who spent 27 years inside that marriage, helping build the life and reputation that made Hugh Jackman such a beloved figure, there may be nothing more painful than watching the audience act as though the future has already chosen its new leading lady. That is when heartbreak stops being about the end of love. That is when it becomes a public stripping away of place, history, and meaning. And this is where the story stops feeling like gossip and starts feeling like loss with an audience. Because the cruelest thing about a public breakup is that the people inside it are forced to live on two timelines at once. There is the private timeline, where grief moves slowly, unevenly, painfully. And then there is the public timeline, where everything moves fast. Headlines rush ahead. New photos appear. A new romance gets framed as exciting, hopeful, even glamorous. The emotional gap between those two timelines is where humiliation begins. That may be exactly why Deborra Lee's words struck such a nerve. When she finally spoke after filing for divorce in May 2025, she did not sound like someone casually reflecting on an old relationship. She spoke about the traumatic journey of betrayal and described the breakdown of the marriage as a profound wound that cuts deep. Those are not light words. They are not neutral words. They suggest a level of hurt that goes far beyond two people simply deciding to grow separately after many years together. And once the public heard that language, the entire emotional script changed. Suddenly, the separation announcement from September 2023 looked different. At the time, it had sounded gracious and controlled, full of gratitude and mutual respect. But after Deborra Lee's later statement, many people began to see that earlier message as something polished, maybe even protective. Not false, perhaps, but incomplete. The kind of statement people give when the full truth is too painful, too personal, or too damaging to expose in real time. That is why every public step Hugh takes now seems to carry double meaning. On its own, a date night is just a date night. A red carpet appearance is just another celebrity moment. A photo together is just a photo. But in this story, none of those moments arrive empty. They arrive after Deborra Lee's betrayal statement. They arrive after the divorce filing. They arrive after the public learned that what once looked like one of Hollywood's safest marriages ended with language this raw. So, the public does not read Hugh and Sutton's appearances as isolated moments. It reads them as part of a larger emotional sequence. And that sequence has only become more visible. Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster's relationship was publicly confirmed in early 2025, and their appearances continued through late 2025 and into 2026, including becoming Instagram official in November 2025 and attending a Broadway night out on the 14th of April 2026. There is still no credible public confirmation of an engagement or wedding, but there is very clearly a public pattern of closeness, visibility, and forward motion. That is more than enough for rumor channels and audiences to imagine the next step, whether or not that step is actually happening. And maybe that is what makes this so brutal for people who identify with Deborra Lee. Because when the world starts imagining your former partner's future before it has even fully processed your pain, it can feel like your history is being downgraded in real time. The years you built together do not disappear, but they begin to lose their place in the public mind. They stop being the main story. They become backstory. And for someone who spent nearly 30 years inside that marriage, that shift may feel colder than any formal announcement ever could. This is also why the public keeps returning to the question of image. For years, Hugh Jackman benefited from an unusually strong reputation as one of the good men in Hollywood. His marriage to Deborra Lee was part of that image. It supported the idea that he was loyal, grounded, and different from the usual celebrity archetype. So when the marriage ended, and Deborra Lee later introduced the word betrayal into the public conversation, the damage was not limited to the relationship itself. It hit the mythology around him. It made people wonder whether the image they trusted had been more fragile than it seemed. That is the real sting under a headline like this. Not a confirmed wedding, not even a confirmed plan, but the possibility that Deborra Lee is watching the world emotionally rehearse Hugh's next forever while still carrying the wound of the first one. That is why the phrase, "a kick in the teeth," feels so powerful. It captures the insult of timing, the cruelty of optics, and the loneliness of being the person whose pain becomes the quiet background to someone else's bright new chapter. And in stories like this, that may be the deepest cut of all. Not that love ended. In the end, what makes this story so haunting is not what has been officially announced. It is what the silence, the timing, and the contrast have led people to feel. Because the most painful endings are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the ones wrapped in polite statements, careful wording, and public restraint. While underneath all of that, something far more devastating is breaking apart. That is exactly why Deborra Lee's eventual words carried such force. When she described the end of the marriage as a profound wound and spoke of a traumatic journey of betrayal, she gave the world a glimpse of the emotional truth as she experienced it. And once that truth entered the conversation, the entire story changed shape. From that point on, Hugh Jackman's visible new life could no longer be seen in isolation. His relationship with Sutton Foster, which became public in early 2025 and has continued through public appearances into April 2026, now exists in the shadow of Deborra Lee's pain. Whether fair or unfair, that is how public stories work. One person's forward motion becomes another person's public contrast. A smile becomes a symbol. A date night becomes a signal. A serious romance becomes, in the eyes of many, emotional proof that one chapter is being closed while another is being celebrated. And that is why the wedding angle keeps pulling people in, even without any credible confirmation of an engagement or wedding. What the public is reacting to is not a ceremony. It is the feeling of replacement. The feeling that when a long marriage ends in pain, the appearance of a new, increasingly public relationship can look like history being overwritten in real time. For someone who gave 27 years to that marriage, that public rewriting can feel harsher than any official announcement ever could. That may be the deepest cruelty in all of this. Deborra Lee was there before the mythology fully formed. Before Hugh Jackman became the untouchable symbol of charm, loyalty, and emotional stability that so many people admired. Their marriage helped build that image. It reassured the public. It made him seem different. So, when the marriage ended, and Deborra Lee later used language that suggested real emotional damage, the collapse was not just personal, it was symbolic. The audience was forced to confront the possibility that what looked solid from the outside may have been breaking for much longer than anyone knew. And once a beloved image cracks, people do not stop at the facts. They search for meaning. They go back through old interviews, old appearances, old declarations of love, trying to find the first fracture. They ask darker questions. Was the fairy tale already fading before the public ever noticed? Did Deborra Lee sense the ending long before the announcement came? Was the graceful statement in 2023 the last layer of protection around a private heartbreak that was already too painful to explain? Those questions remain speculation, not established fact. But they are exactly what keep a story like this burning in the public imagination. And perhaps that is the final tragedy here. Not simply that a marriage ended, not simply that a new romance began, but that the emotional timelines now seem so painfully uneven. Deborra Lee's public words are tied to grief, betrayal, and injury. Hugh's public image, at least for now, is tied to movement, companionship, and a future that appears to be unfolding openly. That imbalance is what gives the story its sting. It is what makes people talk about kicks in the teeth, humiliation, and heartbreak that feels larger than a normal breakup. Because when one person is still associated with the wound, and the other is already associated with what comes next, the contrast can feel merciless. So, no, there may not be a confirmed wedding, but emotionally, that almost stops mattering. Because in the minds of the public, the next chapter has already started writing itself. And for Deborra Lee, that may be the hardest part of all. Not just losing the marriage, but watching the world rush to romanticize what comes after it, while her pain is still the last honest thing echoing from what came before.